All we need sometimes is the right lens to see things clearly. How we see the world shapes the way we live. And many of us are misliving simply because we are not seeing clearly. Now, the way that we see the world is informed by ideas. Those ideas become patterns of thinking, worldviews, or in the language of psychology, mental maps. And these maps or worldviews or patterns of thinking form the way we move in the world. But what happens when that worldview, when that pattern of thinking, when that mental map is rooted in lies? Michael's dad walked out of his life when he was really young. And in his heart, this idea was planted. Everyone you love will leave you. Time went on, but the lie began to grow, and as Michael got older, him and his closest childhood friend began to drift apart. Not because of anything that happened relationally, but simply because of circumstance. And when that began to happen, the voice in his head became loud and clear with that lie. Everyone you love will leave you. So Michael did the only thing he thought he could do, was to leave them before they could leave him. And he ghosted his closest friend. To mend the ache of that loneliness he often felt, Michael began to invest all of his energies into his romantic relationships with women. But this time, he learned his lesson. He built a wall around his heart that was impenetrable. His emotions and his truest self, all was hidden away to protect himself from being wounded again. Anytime he felt himself becoming attached or vulnerable, that voice in his head would get loud and clear again. Everyone you love will leave you. So he would self-sabotage every relationship to avoid being heartbroken. What followed Michael's life was a trail of relational wreckage, and it left him feeling the weight of never being known. And despite all of his measures to protect himself, he was broken. All Rebecca ever wanted was to be seen. However, nothing she did ever seemed to make her mom proud. One of her earliest memories was after a dance competition where she had danced her young heart out, knowing her mom would be in the crowd, hoping that all of her hard work and attention to detail would have finally paid off. And as she comes off the stage and all of her friends and dance partners are being celebrated and congratulated and brought flowers, she is met with a look of disappointment. And the only thing her mother told her that way on the ride home was, "You could have smiled more." It was in that moment that she internalized this lie: you will never be enough. As a teenager, she would spend hours looking in the mirror, not admiring herself, but rather picking apart every aspect of her appearance. What began as comparison quickly became criticism, which ultimately became self-hatred. And as long as she can remember, she's been trying to compete with a person who does not exist. She's always felt the pressure to perform for people around her so that one day she would feel like enough. The lie she believed shaped her life. Now, though Michael and Rebecca are not their real names, and the details of their stories have been changed to protect these identities, these people are real. And these stories are real. And they show us the powers that the lies we believe can live in us, how they can live in us. Dallas Willard says it this way: we live at the mercy of our ideas. Right? Some ideas come in and convince people to believe things such as the royal family is actually lizard people, right? Or that the earth is flat, or things of those nature. Some ideas carry the kind of power that causes people to fly planes into buildings and shoot up schools and churches. Ideas are powerful and often create futures. These ideas that have lies embedded in them bring about futures with great loss, destruction, and harm. And according to Jesus and the biblical authors, there is something or someone behind those lies. Those lies are animated by evil. And this evil animating force has become known as the Satan. I believe we are misliving because of the lies we believe and the evil one who's bringing about those lies. And the only way for us to see clearly is for us to put on the lens of the scriptures and see things as they actually are. We are embarking on a new short series leading up to Easter entitled Good News, which is the word, the gospel that we've gotten to know, euangelion, good news. And so as we lead up to Easter, we are examining the message of Easter. Many of us could probably recite the gospel in some form or function, but what we're really getting down to in this series is what exactly have we been rescued from? To be rescued, we have to understand the totality of being rescued, we have to realize that the wonderful news of Easter is that we've been rescued from sin, the Satan, death, and hell. And last week, we looked at sin and how that particularly affects something the biblical authors call the flesh. And today, we're talking about the Satan and lies. If it's your first time here, welcome. It's not always this heavy. I apologize. But I want to give us a lay of the land before we get started and establish a framework of the Satan and lies throughout the scriptures, contrasting this with Jesus and truth, and ultimately culminating in how Jesus rescues us from these things. But before we get there, 2 quick pastoral notes. 1, I believe we need to be brought to a place of sobriety. And 2, I believe God wants to set people free this morning from the illusion of lies. First, sobriety. C.S. Lewis, one of the GOATs in my opinion, has this line. He says this: there are 2 equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall into about the devils. One is to believe their existence. One is to disbelieve their existence, rather. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both, that's a typo, and hail a materialist or magician with the same delight. So, there's 2 errors that we make about the Satan and the demonic. One is to be superstitious. You know these people. Everything is the devil. Flat tire, devil. Ran out of toothpaste, devil. Got in the fight with my wife, devil. All of it's him, right? There's nothing that's not him. And it's like, or maybe you weren't checking your tire pressure, and maybe you were a jerk that morning, right? And maybe you just forgot to buy toothpaste, dude. So, like, not everything is the devil. Like, he's probably pretty busy not to just kind of sabotage your morning on your way to church. You know, but it's the kind of idea that the devil's behind every bush. And we kind of come obsessed with that sort of thing. And in certain Christian circles, right, that's the kind of language and vernacular used about every single little thing. That's one error. The opposite is to become secular in our thinking, meaning we remove the reality of the Satan altogether. And in this way of thinking, we adapt a materialist, Western, secular ideology about the way that the world works. And we will follow up on that later. But those are 2 and equal opposite errors. But my invitation, I believe the invitation from the Spirit this morning, is for us to enter a place of sobriety. That we are aware and attuned to what reality actually is, and we see it for what it actually is. Sobriety. The next is to be set free. As I was sharing those stories, I just have a sense this morning that somebody really identified with those stories. That maybe it sounded a lot like your story, or parts of your story. And even as I was talking about those things, a lie came up for you. One that you've been believing your whole life. One that you've been constantly telling yourself. And no matter how many people who love you have told you that it's not true, it has formed and shaped the way you've lived your life, the decisions that you've made, how you see yourself in your relationship with God. And I believe the Spirit is inviting you to be set free this morning. That the Spirit wants to expose that thought for exactly what it is, a lie from the Satan. And he wants to set you free into God's miraculous love and to embrace the identity you actually have. And even as I'm talking, you might be thinking this is you, but another thought came in saying, that's not you. Disregard this message. And I believe that, too, is from the pit of hell. And the Lord wants to redeem that very moment and that thought that's in your head right now. So, let's talk about the Satan. Hard transition, I know. But some of you might be wondering, I think he's mistaken. He keeps putting a "the" in front of Satan's name, and it's really weird. Why does he keep doing that? Like, someone got to let the brother know it's just Satan. Actually, not. If you've been here for some amount of time, you know what's about to happen. But if you haven't, welcome. To put it plainly, Satan is not a name. It is a title. In Hebrew, it's the word Hasatan, and it literally means the adversary or the one who opposes, the enemy, if you will. And so nowhere in the scriptures do we get a name for this evil being. We only ever get titles for it. Things like the Satan, the evil one, the tempter, the destroyer, the deceiver, the dragon, the ancient serpent, the prince of the power of the air, the prince of this world. We get titles describing this being. And for our time together, I want to just talk about a few of the most common ones that we use in our modern vernacular. The first is the Satan. So Hasatan, meaning the adversary. Again, not a name, but a title, rather to describe what he's about. He's about nothing. He's for nothing, but wants to destroy everything. He is the one who opposes. He is the enemy. He's the one who directly opposes you. The next most common is that of the devil. Again, not a name. In Greek, diabolos, meaning the slanderer, the one who lies against or accuses or speaks lies about. And this is in line with all the things that Jesus teaches about him that we'll go over shortly. And the last one that you might be thinking is the term Lucifer, which you're like, that's his name, that's his thing. Again, not exactly the case. So that comes from Isaiah chapter 14. And there's so much happening here that we do not have time to go into. But essentially, Isaiah is talking about the king of Babylon falling. And as he's doing this, he's mapping this story about the king of Babylon being corrupted and ultimately falling. And he's mapping that onto the story in Genesis 3 about the serpent and his deception and that fall. And there's a lot happening there, like what Isaiah is doing to prophetically critique Canaanite culture and some of their origin stories, which we do not have time to go into today. But to put it simply, the term Lucifer is nowhere in any Greek or Hebrew translation of the Bible. It's just not. The phrase that gets translated that, or gets used that, is the phrase morning star, son of the dawn, which in Hebrew is Hillel ben Shachar, which if you really want to impress somebody at lunch, just throw that out there just to impress them with some of your Hebrew knowledge. But the phrase that gets translated that is morning star, son of the dawn, which is Hillel ben Shachar. Now, when the Bible was being translated into Latin from Greek and Hebrew, one of the most famous Bible translators by the name of Jerome took that Hebrew word, Hillel ben Shachar, and gave it the Latin term, which is Luciferius, which means son of the dawn. And it's also the name given to the planet Venus. And so the way that I would imagine the biblical author's mind is Venus is the last and brightest star we see as the sun is rising in the morning. It is almost like it is holding on as long as it possibly can for night to stay, even though the sun is coming. And so the biblical authors have used this imagery to describe the evil one. The one who wants to maintain darkness as long as humanly possible as the light comes to rid it from that place. And so this is what the biblical authors are doing. And so that Latin term, Luciferius, became Lucifer. And in some translations, they just kept that Latin word. So is it wrong to use it? No, but why are you speaking Latin, right? That's kind of the question. And so, again, it is just a title meaning morning star, or son of the dawn. And so, the biblical authors never give this being a name, which sounds kind of strange, except for the reason they do this, Jesus and the biblical authors, is they do not want to give this evil one the dignity of a name. It is almost like a subtle shot at him to never give him the name that he is due, right? The title that he is due. They don't want to give and assign to him more power or authority or renown or reputation than he deserves. And so they take all of these digs at him, the slanderer, the evil one, the serpent, right? All of these negative and bad images they use to describe this evil one. So he does not have a name, he only has titles. Secondarily, I want to talk about his presence in our world. Now, according to modern Western thinking, the idea of an evil one or an enemy or a devil or a Satan or whatever sounds archaic. It sounds old. It sounds like something that you would do to make sense of a chaotic and crazy world. But for Jesus and the biblical authors, the Satan is very real. He's not a fictional character used to make sense of the chaotic world we live in. He's a real and malevolent being who is bent on destroying all of God's good world. Now, there's an idea that I want to do away with immediately. When we think of the Satan, some things may come to mind. A pitchfork, red paint on their face, diabolical in the corner. You may think of the angel and the devil on the shoulders whispering about decisions to make. There may be some different images in your mind. And when you think of the term like spiritual warfare, for some reason like Gladiator comes to mind, right? And it's God and the devil and they're fighting and it's this big epic battle. The only problem with all of those is the scriptures. One, that's never how the enemy is ever defined. And two, God, Yahweh, and the devil are not even on the same field, okay? They're not even close to being on the same. It is not an equal battle of powers. In the revelation of Jesus, the last book in the scriptures, we get this beautiful image of God triumphing over evil. Now, the scene is being set up like it's going to be this big battle, but it is super anticlimactic. Because as these kind of armies get ready to face off, suddenly the very next thing that happens is God just casts them into a lake of fire. There's no shouting. There's no swords. There's no great battle. God just takes care of evil for good in a moment. The devil is a created being. He does not have the power to create. He can only distort and destroy the good. And he is not on the same plane as Yahweh our God. He could obliterate and wipe him out in just the speaking of a word. And that's what we see in Revelation. He casts him into the lake of fire in just a moment. So I want you to get that image out of your mind, or that idea out of your mind. God will do away quickly with evil. Now, what happens when we don't have a theology of evil and there is not a Satan in our worldview? Well, first, the blame simply shifts. When I talk to my atheist and skeptic friends, they have a beef with God they don't believe in. They are angry with him about the brokenness in the world. I think about a famous comedian who was on TV being interviewed, and he was asked the question, what would you tell God if you could see him? And his response was, how dare you? Bone cancer in children, right? War, disease, famine. And he spoke with such passion and vitriol. And it seems like a lot of emotion going towards something that doesn't exist. I don't see anyone raging at unicorns in that same way, right? Or other fictitious animals in their minds. It is only God that deals with that kind of animosity. Why? Because when you do not have a framework for evil, all the blame gets shifted on God. And that's bad theology. The other thing that happens is when there's no paradigm for an evil one, people become the Satan. It is the person you disagree with. It is the political figure you oppose. It is someone else somewhere in the world that is perpetuating and causing evil. It becomes personified in a human being. When you no longer have a paradigm for evil, people become evil personified. And that leads to all sorts of ways in which we live. And so, a famous movie, Kevin Spacey played this character, and he said that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was causing people to believe that he does not exist. And I think this is one of the modern errors that we make. And there's all sorts of ripple effects about what that ultimately brings. So that's his presence in our world. Now, what about his purpose? John Mark Comer says this: for Jesus, the devil is an archetype of a villain who is hell-bent on destruction. He just wants to watch the world burn. His motto: tear it all down. Wherever he finds life, he tries to stamp it out. Beauty, deface it. Love, corrupt it. Unity, fragment it into a million pieces. Human flourishing, push it into anarchy or tyranny. Either will do. His anti-life, pro-death, pro-chaos agenda is an insatiable fire. This is his goal and his motive. Jesus, in speaking about the devil in John 8, says this. And speaking to the Pharisees, he says, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. Hear this line. He was a murderer from the beginning. This is Jesus' framework for what his purpose is. Later in John 10:10, Jesus says the enemy comes in to steal, kill, and destroy. He's not just some mischievous being who wants to make your life inconvenient. He's a murderer who wants to ruin you. He wants to steal you of joy, life, peace, love, all of the beautiful things in life. He wants to kill anything that brings life. And he wants to destroy everything till it's brought to utter rubble. He is not somebody who's just kind of a bad guy. He is evil personified. Do not be deceived. You have an enemy who means you harm, and great harm. This is the paradigm that Jesus sets up. Now, how does he do this? When Jesus gives this talk in John 8, he finishes it by saying this: not holding on to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. How does the enemy work most common in the world? Notice Jesus here doesn't say anything about like tsunamis or famine or war, though I think the enemy is present in a lot of those, if not all of those. But he says his main tactic is that of lies. That's the way he does things. This is Jesus' most in-depth teaching on the Satan, and he reveals his tactic: lies. And we live into those lies. Dallas Willard says this: ideas are the primary stronghold of evil in the human self and in society. Lies can be very powerful. I want to briefly take a look at the story of Eve and the serpent in the garden as a way to look at the anatomy of a lie. Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord had made. And he said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from the tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat from the fruit that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now, you're familiar with this story, so all of the red flags are flying off in your mind, and you're like, "Don't fall for it." Newsflash, she does, right? She partakes of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, whatever you believe about this story, whether it's like videotape footage of what actually happened or a picture of evil influencing humans, here is what we know. The enemy comes to her with an idea, and the idea is a lie. And this is the primary way he works in the world. Notice the first thing he says. Did God really say? And then he misquotes God entirely. He says that you can't have any of the fruit in any of these trees in the garden. What he's trying to do is immediately take shots at God's character and his heart. And he's already sowing in the idea that God's holding out on her. He's putting it out further and further than God ever said. Did God really say? This is an attack on God's authority. And this is the way the enemy loves to spin lies. He begins to attack the very word of God. Did God really say? I mean, is it that big of a deal, really? Is this really the best that he has for you? Did God really say? The next lie that he spins is this: you will not certainly die. If you remember from last week, this line in Genesis is you will certainly die in English, but in Hebrew it's you will die, right? Super dead, as we talked about last week. The enemy takes that line from God and he twists it, and he says, you will not die. You will not certainly die. You will not be super dead, right? As we talked about last week. And what he's doing is he's putting out a blatant lie about the consequences of sin. And this is how the enemy gets us. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, look at everybody else. It's harmless. It's not a big deal, right? Nothing will certainly bad come out of this. I mean, who cares? It's just you fill in the blank. And lastly, he speaks to our desire when he says this: you will be like God. Now, I realize, like, if you were, like, walking the street and someone's like, hey, do you want to become like God? Chances are you call the cops on them, right? You would not be tempted away from somebody like that. You'd be like, there's someone whacked out on the side of the corner here. Come take care of this. But this is a desire that you have. And it may not be a desire that you want to name, but it's often the way that we live. Because at the root of that idea is this: being God does not mean you want to be in control over the whole universe and dictate how things run, but it is this: you want to be in control over your world. And you want to be in control over what you think is good and bad. When Adam and Eve partake of the tree, they fundamentally say that we get to define good and evil on our own terms, not you. And that is the great human struggle. And the serpent speaks to that desire by saying, you can be just like God, defining good and evil on your own terms, based on whatever meets your needs. And this is the way he likes to spin his lies. The next thing that happens is, the next paradigm I want to explore briefly is the power that's behind these ideas. Paul says this in Ephesians 6. And this is like a super famous passage, right? The passage that precedes, the passage that follows this one is the armor of God, one that you're probably familiar with in some form or fashion. But the verses that precede it say this: so that you can take a stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms. There's an assumption that biblical authors have, and it's this: that there is a reality beyond that which we can see. And in this reality exist spiritual beings who have agendas, plans, and wills that seek to accomplish this. All the way from the very first pages of Scripture, all the way through, there's this backdrop of spiritual beings and how they exist. And the invitation for us to see is that behind the things that we can see are things that we can't see: powers, rulers, authorities at play. Right behind tyrannical governments and things that bring about evil and genocide and war, that there is actually beings behind those things. I've mentioned this story multiple times, but I think it's helpful in this context to bring it up again. There's a scene from the life of Daniel where Daniel's praying, and he's waiting weeks for this prayer to be resolved. And then one day, an angel appears before Daniel, kind of out of breath. Oh, dude, sorry, man, I got here as soon as I could. He's like, we were just wrestling with the prince of Persia for a while. Had to call in some reinforcements, but now I'm here. And then the story just moves on like business as usual. Okay, time out. What? Who's the Prince of Persia? Who are you fighting? How are you fighting? What took so long, right? There's all of these questions that come up after that moment. And it's because the biblical authors are assuming you're just following the story in line. That the biblical author's understanding is that there are actually entities, spirits that oversee cities and nations and ideologies and all these different things that are behind the things that we actually see. And so as Daniel is interceding for his city of the place of Persia for it to become like the kingdom of God, there are active evil forces working against Daniel's prayer. And all of this is just a normal Tuesday to Daniel. He doesn't see any of this happening. And the biblical authors kind of give you a peek behind the curtain, if you will. And so behind governments and systems and people are these powers. Dr. Tim Mackie says this: if you consider all the uses of power vocabulary in the New Testament, you discover that the powers are both heavenly and earthly, divine and human, spiritual and political, invisible and structural. So the invitation the biblical authors want you to see is that when we see evil expressed in the world, things aren't always as they seem. There are things behind those things. As many of you know, there was another tragic school shooting. And there seems to be something particularly about the place that we live in America that seems to be ripe with this. I am not interested in getting into political conversations about why that is. But we would be naive to believe that there's not something deep and dark behind this. That anytime we see this, we can see the fingerprints of evil all over it, and it tells us where the power is coming from. And not that there's not pragmatic and practical and good thinking things we can do to solve this issue, but it's not the root of the issue. The root of the issue is evil in nature. And every time we hear the story, months and months, things come out about the individual who chose to do something this evil. And what do you always see behind this person? An idea, a thought, an ideology, that a seed of a lie was planted and it materialized in death. Do not be deceived, brothers and sisters. Not all ideas are equal. Some ideas have a will of their own that mean to bring harm and horror. Read any manifesto of any person who's perpetrated evil, and you see the fingerprints of lies all over it. And we wonder the question, how can somebody do something like that? Their heart is bent towards darkness as this lie festers and grows and expands and creates a world that does not exist. And it keeps them blind. This is not to say that when people do evil things, it's not their fault. It is. They choose to partake in evil. But hear me in this, it's not only their fault. There are things and powers at play behind. You see, the real problem with secularism is it doesn't give an answer for evil. It makes it seem that the world would be such a better place if we could just progress more and become more educated and just explain to it. And if only people understood, but it never deals with the problem of evil. It never has an answer in the face of tragedy and heartbreak because there is none. And the secularist worldview, this is all happenstance. This is all happen chance. You're just here by a miracle and just by random molecules and a big bang a long time ago. This all just happened to be. So guess what? We're just lucky to be alive, so we should just enjoy the little time that we have. But it has no explanation for evil. The world just is that way. And it only offers sweet pleasantries in those moments. But no one's actually dealing with the problem. What grieved me as I was reading what happened at that Covenant school, every news organization was pushing their political agenda of what they want to see come out of this. And not one of them was mourning for the families who lost people. Not one of them was naming the great pain and loss that was suffered from the people who died that day. All of them were playing by the metrics of power, which shows me we don't even understand what we're dealing with here. We're playing by human schemes pushed by elemental forces. And so we see that what's behind ideas is warfare, and human lives are the ones at risk. Winston Churchill, who's this great figure from the World War II era, said this: "The empires of the future will be empires of the mind." He understood that it would no longer be about land and territory and ruling and reigning, but it became about what ideas were the most captivating. And at this time, Churchill's fighting against the propaganda of communism and all that that brought on, and he saw where this road ultimately led. 2 Corinthians 10, Paul says this: "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world, sword, shield, gun, tank. On the contrary, they have divine power," hear this, "to demolish strongholds." What does that mean? We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. What you realize is the greatest fight of your life is not a physical embodied person on the other side of the world who does not agree with you. It is the war inside your own head about what thoughts you let permeate in your soul. That is the greatest fight that you fight. And Paul says that we have been given divine power to demolish strongholds. There are strongholds present even in this room today that have people captive to these elemental forces, to these powers that be. And the Lord longs to set those people free. So when we realize that the war that we're in is not fought with bullets and tanks and guns and armor, but it's actually fought in the realm of ideas, the real question is, then who controls the narrative? If it's not about brute force and power, it's about influence and coercion. What is the voice you listen to the most? Do not be deceived. It has great power and influence over your life. It shapes the trajectory of how you live, the voices you listen to the most. It sets about a life path ahead of an individual because of the power of those voices. There is a phrase that's being used right now, and it's the phrase dirty war. And it's a way to describe kind of the new landscape of modern warfare as we know it. Foreign governments all around the world, and ours too, are not spending a majority of their money and financing and time and energy on like new jets, bigger tanks, bigger bombs. You know what they are spending all their time and energy on? Troll farms. They're these places where people are hired to pretend as other citizens of other countries to provoke and to put out conspiracy theories, ideas, whatever, that are purposefully inflammatory to turn people against one another. This is not a political statement at all. This is just a matter of fact that right now foreign governments, and ours too, are disseminating information into people through social media, through YouTube, through whatever thing that you're on, to form ideas in your mind. And here's the end goal: to pit people against one another. The term disinformation is the term meaning information that is provided that is meant to deceive and turn people against one another. One question: is it working right now? Look around. Now, it's called dirty warfare because whether you know it or not, we have the largest and most expansive military in the world. So this idea in your mind of like Red Dawn, like Russia coming to invade, super not likely, almost impossible. But what can happen is seeds of disinformation are planted and a country devolves and turns in on itself because of lies. This is why it's called dirty war. Foreign powers want to disseminate and destroy through disinformation. Now, this is not to say, so the boogeyman's out there, watch it, but this is to say, look, this is the same exact tactic the enemy uses. He plants seeds of doubt and disinformation in you that turn you against yourself and others, that bring about isolation and ultimately destruction. What sets up 2 Corinthians 2:15 is actually 2 Corinthians 2:8, where Paul tells the church in Colossae this: see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental forces of this world rather than on Christ. Paul is warning the church that it's possible to follow Jesus, to worship in church, to think that you love him, but are actually captivated by deceptive ideologies that are empowered by elemental forces and human tradition. So Paul's saying, you feel encouraged right now? Do you just feel like built up? Like, man, we could just take the world on. It is such a good place, right? I paint the black picture to show the diamond in all of its glory, which is, let's get to the good news. Jesus says this in John 8. To the Jews who had believed in him, Jesus said this: if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Hear this. Then you will know the truth. And what will the truth do? The truth will set you free. The fundamental assumption is this, that we are enslaved to lies. And that which liberates us is truth. It sets us free and to live the life that we long to live. The modern understanding of freedom is do whatever you want. The biblical understanding of freedom is you are free to do that which is good. Because doing what you want doesn't always bring about good. That's the ancient and true idea of freedom. The more modern one is just, I don't want to be impeded on at all. The biblical modern freedom is restraint that brings about the good. That is true freedom. Tim Mackey again says, for Paul, enslavement to the powers is the human condition apart from the messianic hope. To say it plainly, it's this: Jesus sets us free from the tyranny of lies with truth in and of himself. What did he say about himself? He said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am life. Jesus is the one who sets us free from the prison of the lies that we are enslaved to. Now, to our teaching text, which don't worry, we're almost done. I'm not just barely getting started, so hang in there with me. But Colossians 2:15, which, if you're going to press me for one of my favorite verses, this is it. Paul says, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by way of the cross. What is the message of Easter? Yes, you have an enemy that means you harm. Yes, he's disseminating lies into our culture, into our world, into our hearts. And yes, it brings about death and destruction. But thanks be to God, because the story of Easter is that through the cross, Jesus has overcome the powers. That Jesus dying on the cross, what happened in that moment is all of the workers of evil are pressing in and on around Jesus to kill him, to destroy him. The evil ones are animating the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the very ones who are supposed to recognize Jesus, reject him and have him condemned to death. And is at that moment with Jesus on the cross that the powers think that they've won. We have killed the Son of God. They exact all their energy, all their power, all of their influence to have Jesus killed, little knowing they were playing into his hand. Jesus says this line, nobody takes my life, I lay it down freely. As the enemy thought it was giving its striking blow to Jesus on the cross, it was actually fulfilling God's plan. Because Jesus does not fight with the metrics of power by the world. The metrics of power of Jesus are love. And so in this moment of great sacrificial love, where the enemy thinks that he has won, Jesus is overcoming the enemies. And by his sacrificial love, we are set free. Because it was not the powers or death or hell or the evil one that kept him in the grave. Love resurrected him on Easter morning. And in that moment, he triumphed over them. And I love that line. Made a public spectacle of them. Humiliated them because they thought they had won. They were celebrating and enjoying. There's this line in Peter where it says that when Jesus descended into the grave, he went and proclaimed to the spirits there, you have been beaten. you've been destroyed. And so what's happened in this moment is, in light of Easter, the powers have lost their power. They are a lion without teeth and claws, only roaring, only scaring, but have lost the very thing they could do to kill you. This is why Paul says the line, "Oh, death, where is your sting?" Because Jesus has overcome it all. And so the enemy now is like a wounded animal, clawing and scratching and trying to destroy everything he can to bring down God's good world. But Jesus has overcome them. The language biblical scholars use to do this is this of Christus Victor. Christ is victorious over the enemies and powers. And because of Jesus' resurrection, brothers and sisters, you are set free. You no longer have to live underneath the bondage of lies anymore. And the enemy, though he means you harm, has lost all his power because Jesus is risen from the grave. The very best thing the enemy could do is kill you. And that means nothing because Jesus has conquered the grave. And we will be resurrected with him. So death, where is your sting? Hell, where is your power? Jesus is alive and has overcome the powers and principalities and authorities. We're going to close now. And as we do, I want to read the words of Fleming Rutledge, who says this: "We are not prisoners of the powers. Rather, we are prisoners of hope. We have been chained to the resurrection hope that Jesus is alive." Brothers and sisters, would you stand with me if you're able? Come, Holy Spirit. As the good news that you have conquered the grave and you have conquered your enemy has been proclaimed, the enemy is roaring in the ears of your people, trying to keep them in bondage to sin and bondage to lies. By the authority of Jesus right now, would you silence that voice, Lord? And would only your voice come through? Your voice of love and peace that is drawing people on to yourself. Your voice that is proclaiming, "I have overcome evil." Would that shine and translate through now? And God, as we worship, would we respond to you? As we worship, would we respond to the good news of Easter, that we've been rescued from the Satan and lies. In Jesus' name, amen.